Picture, if you will, an apple. It's red or green, it's crunchy and juicy. It's a very nice apple. And that apple has a market value. Now, picture a change in the world that results in everyone deciding that apples should be free. In that scenario, what happens to the people who plant and grow and harvest the apples? They still have a product, but they can't get paid in the way they used to. Now, picture that apple is in demand everywhere. Every time you turn on your TV and see a commercial, there's that apple. When you download an app for your phone, there's that apple. In the movies, in video games, in restaurants, there's that apple. In 2015, the music business is kind of like this. Everyone wants to use music because music sets moods. It creates emotions. It makes people want to dance. In other words, it has value. Yet the marketplace says it's free. This is the dilemma that people who make music find themselves in today. It still costs the same to record and press and promote an album, yet we can't sell this product like we used to. So those of us who produce the music, the artists and labels, have to wonder how long we can keep this up. Is there a future in music, or what?
Can I have a taste of your ice cream? Can I lick the crumbs from your table? Can I interfere in your crisis? No, mind your own business. No, mind your own business.
Welcome to The Future of What, the show about the music industry. I'm Portia Sabin. Thanks for joining me. On today's episode, we're looking at how music went from being an object you bought in a record store to being a tiny digital file you downloaded for free on the internet. This wasn't just a physical change, it was a behavioral, psychological, and even, some claim, a spiritual change. We'll look into that more later in the show when we talk to Stephen Witt, the author of the upcoming book, How Music Got Free. However, some people did take advantage of this change by using it the old-fashioned way, to make more money. Grooveshark was a service that capitalized on the music for free model, and it just went out of business after 10 years. To discuss this with us is Jim Mahoney, the U.S. General Manager of Merlin. Jim, welcome to The Future of What?
Thank you, Portia. How are you?
I am great. Glad to hear you.
Nice to hear you as well.
So, to begin with, Merlin is the global digital rights agency for the independent label sector. Can you explain what that actually means for the people who think that just sounded like a lot of words?
Definitely. When you've helped me before with taglines and mission statements, so maybe I'll come back to you about that. So, traditionally, record labels, music labels need or rely on distributors to get their music out to retail and also to digital retailers. Digital retailers, Spotify and RDO and Deezer and companies like that. So the digital services, I'll call them retailers, need a mechanism to license the rights to use the music, perform the music that belong to record companies. And many independent labels decided that they didn't really want a distributor in between them and these digital retailers. They wanted to do it on their own, but that became that would be a terrible burden on each retailer to then go and license all of the independent labels that would like to go to direct with them. And so these independent labels formed a global not-for-profit body called Merlin. And then Merlin engages with the digital service providers on behalf of our members, concluding licenses that we would put in front of our members who, on a non-exclusive basis, can opt in or opt out to participate in our licenses.
Cool.
Does that make sense, or was that even longer?
No, I think that should make sense to people.
Okay.
So Merlin is unique in that in addition to negotiating deals with new services like Beats, for example, Merlin has represented independent labels in several important legal battles with entities like LimeWire.
Exactly.
Can you tell us a little about that case in particular?
The LimeWire case, I didn't work at Merlin at the time, so my view of it would have been, I worked at A2IM when Merlin achieved its settlement with LimeWire on the infringements from LimeWire. As I understand it, litigation on that side of things can be very, very expensive, millions of dollars, and opens you to risk of countersuit, right, before a decision is reached. So I believe that Merlin's strategy with LimeWire was to put itself in position, and I think the courts, I don't remember the Latin name for it, but I think what they did is they notify the courts that they are an interested party in ongoing litigation, which then preserves rights for that interested party to come in should a legal settlement or judgment be rendered. I'm not an attorney, and I wasn't at Merlin, so that's when the LimeWire settlement was reached. But I know that in the space where Merlin achieves commercial infringement settlements, Merlin has never been party to bringing litigation or legal action against any individual user, but commercial entities. In the place where commercial entities infringe and have been found guilty of infringing on copyrights, Merlin is in place to come in and make that and settle that claim on behalf of their members. Without Merlin's representation, independents had traditionally been left out of these types of infringement actions. Most famously, I think that there was a service called Kazaa, an infringing service called Kazaa, that settled with the majors. And it was I think it was 2007, before Merlin existed, and independents weren't paid out on that settlement. It's interesting. I don't know factually, I don't know the legal facts on it, but I believe that when Kazaa settled, they settled with the majors, and the majors claimed the market shares of the independent labels that they distributed when negotiating the settlement. None of that money then got passed on to those independent labels that the majors distribute. And so if there was a Waterloo moment, a battle cry from the independents, never again after Kazaa, and it was in part the impetus to form Merlin.
So we asked you here today to comment on the demise of Groove Shark. Groove Shark was a digital service that operated for 10 years without licensing music. Can you tell us about Merlin's relationship with Groove Shark over the past 10 years, even though you were not at Merlin for this whole period?
Sure. Well, what I can say is that Merlin welcomes new digital players to the market, right? Legal players. But from day one, Merlin saw Groove Shark as an infringing service, and didn't reach out to Groove Shark. When Groove Shark first launched and were seeking licenses, Merlin didn't engage. And frankly, Groove Shark didn't reach out to Merlin for one either. Merlin, as I said, saw Groove Shark as an infringing service, and as such, started to prepare a legal case so that they would be in position to represent their members in a legal action. Merlin presumed at the time that the major labels would also sue Groove Shark. And this is probably 2008 or so. And so Merlin's gathering evidence and expecting the majors to sue, and were surprised when the majors were just taking so long. EMI sued, but Universal didn't. I don't believe any of the other majors did, and it gets a bit in the weeds. But Universal was waiting to see sort of the moves of EMI. They were looking to use whatever judgment might come from an EMI lawsuit against Groove Shark to help them on New York State copyright laws and things like that. So it gets in the weeds, as I say, but it turned out it was a failed strategy, and I don't want to comment about what they did, but eventually they got in. In the meantime, Merlin's sitting here, looking at it, interested in its members, hearing more and more from its members about how this service is, hiding behind the DMCA. People are putting up music, and Merlin members are stuck in this game of whack-a-mole, of serving takedown notices that may or may not get attended to, and so on and so forth. So finally, Merlin says, well, what are we going to do? We can't get Merlin can't get the DMCA laws changed, certainly, by itself. Merlin was in its founding days in 2008, 2009, and didn't have the bank machine to unilaterally sue and put Groove Shark out of business. And so we were kind of caught in a bad spot. We'd gathered evidence, but we weren't going to be able to afford to get to the discovery stages of litigation where we were confident that, the proof that we'd need to win would come out. And as history points out, it was the discovery stage where that proof did emerge, because it was internal emails at Grooveshark, that undid them when their principals were telling their staff to upload the music, and in effect then working around the DMCA, or working under the cover of the DMCA but not compliant with it. Right? Their staff were the users. Anyway, so we threatened litigation, we saber rattled, and our members constantly reached out to Grooveshark and made life uncomfortable for them. And Grooveshark they didn't know that we didn't have a ton of money, and they didn't want to court litigation from Merlin. So in around 2009, 2010, Grooveshark reached out to Merlin to talk about an infringement settlement. And so Merlin and Grooveshark reached an infringement settlement that included a pretty nice payout to Merlin members who participated in that settlement. It was also tied to an ongoing license, a commercial license, that included a key aspect. Grooveshark, in essence, was like an audio-only YouTube, right, where it was hiding behind the DMCA, and then the model of block or take down or monetize was the decision of the copyright owner. In 2009, 2010, that didn't really exist, but it was constructed and then used in the Grooveshark settlement and license with Merlin, where members could opt into the Merlin commercial license with Grooveshark, deliver their content, and then put a unilateral block on everything, which would then remove the members from the whack-a-mole takedown process, and ensure that their music wasn't there. Although also, Merlin members could then decide to monetize Grooveshark, and a number of them did, and for a period of time made some significant money through the Grooveshark service. The license itself fell apart or came apart when Grooveshark really weren't in a good position to honor the license, and so there were issues with some of the blocks didn't hold, reporting wasn't good, and ultimately they just stopped paying, and so the license was terminated.
So at the end of April, Grooveshark shut down and posted a notice on their website in which they apologized for their actions and wrote, and I quote, "If you love music and respect the artists, songwriters, and everyone else who makes great music possible, use a licensed service that compensates artists and other rights holders." Do you think their mom made them write that?
I don't know about their mom, but I actually don't know. But fun conjecture here on a radio show would be that the major labels own kind of what the URLs or everything that you can find on the internet that's related to Grooveshark is owned by the major labels, and so I would imagine that smart attorneys for the major labels crafted that message and put it up to the Grooveshark website.
I think you're probably right. Well, thank you for everything you do to support independent labels, Jim, and thanks for being on our show.
Thank you.
Jim Mahoney is U.S. General Manager of Merlin, and he joined us from his New York office.
This ain't pop. It's pop rock. This ain't pop. It's pop rock.
Stephen Witt is the author of the forthcoming book, How Music Got Free. Stephen, welcome to The Future of What?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So you wrote an article for The New Yorker that is the world's most depressing, incredible spy story.
I think that's right. The article is about Del Glover, a worker in a compact disc manufacturing plant in North Carolina, who leaked over 2,000 CDs from the plant over the course of about 7 years. These CDs made their way onto the internet, and they became the primary point of contact for almost all leaked music. So if you ever pirated music in the 2000s, you owe it to this one guy. He was the patient zero of piracy. And that article is an excerpt from my forthcoming book.
And the thing that's so fascinating to me about your article is that it details this kind of underground group of people who called themselves the Scene.
That's right.
Who were really interested in file sharing mainly as a prestige move. You know, it was whoever got a file up first got to have the prestige of having done that.
That's exactly right. So the scene is shortened from the wares scene. And wares there is like software. And they've been cracking files and pirating various forms of media going back to the 80s. But it really was an underground subculture, probably no more than 1,000 or 2,000 people doing this at any given time. Mostly guys in the age range of, let's say, 14 or 15 to about 25. And in 1996, when the MP3 encoder first became available on the web, these guys jumped on it, and they started producing pirated media files using this encoder, and that created the contemporary reality of the music business.
And it's really shocking because, of course, I run an independent record label, and basically we're talking about the entire takedown of my industry really done for no particular reason. It
For
wasn't
thrills, I think.
sort of for thrills, yeah. It wasn't done to make money. And I know that you mentioned that this is one of the things that really eluded the majors for a really long time because they, of course, couldn't imagine anyone doing anything that wasn't for money.
Well, they had an idea this was happening, and inside the Recording Industry Association of America's anti-piracy group, they tracked these guys very carefully from the onset. But because these were anonymous internet networks, usually operating under heavy encryption by invitation only, and you had to get a voucher just to get into any of these groups, they were very hard to crack. So the recording industry was sort of aware that this was going on, but it was even with the cooperation of the FBI, they had just the hardest time shutting these networks down. And they still exist. So when Game of Thrones leaks or, software leaks 2 to 3 weeks early, 9 times out of 10, it's one of these groups because they operate in every media form.
But I think the point I was making is that they weren't pirating music so they could turn around and sell the music.
No, they were not. It really was done out of a sense of almost camaraderie or belonging to this sort of unusual subculture on the internet. A lot of the guys I talked to spoke of sort of the dopamine rush that they would get from leaking an album. And that's why they did it. Most of them, it cost them money. They spent money on broadband and compact discs and really just got thrills in return.
That is so, I'm practically speechless with, I can't even believe that is, because as you can imagine, I mean, as you know well, I'm sure, it had real serious side effects for the music industry.
For the music industry, for the software industry, for the movie industry, and currently for television as well. When Game of Thrones, when 5 or 6 episodes leak before the premiere date, that hurts HBO's bottom line.
Absolutely. So your main guy that you talk about is Del Glover, and it was so fascinating to read his motivations. He actually worked at a Universal pressing plant for CDs, and he managed to smuggle CDs out before the release date. But really, he was doing it less for the prestige than the access it gave him to pirated movies, which he then burned onto DVDs and sold around his hometown.
Glover was really a rogue actor in this, in the sense that he was not interested in prestige online or thrills. What he really wanted was money. So that made him unusual in these groups. Because these guys had, let's say plants or moles in various sectors of the entertainment industry supply chain, they could reliably get stuff like Madden NFL onto their servers maybe a month or 2 months before it was due in stores, and sometimes weeks ahead of when it was even available on other internet pirate sites. Because it was a closed, elite economy, this gave Glover a tremendous edge as a bootlegger. He wasn't the only bootlegger in the state of North Carolina, but he was the best, and he was able to parlay that into quite a lot of cash earnings, as I reveal in my book.
And the thing that struck me about that was in your article, you talk so much about how much money clearly Universal spent so much money on security measures for this pressing plant. And I kept thinking, man, if they'd only just given Del Glover a really nice raise, maybe he wouldn't have had, they could have taken that $10 million they spent on security or whatever, given it to...
I think that's a little naive.
Yeah, no, of course not. I mean, it would never have happened. But you know what I mean? It's like you look at it in the light of eternity, and it's like, oh, God.
Well, Glover worked really hard. He wasn't just some guy stealing CDs from the plant. He actually got promoted several times.
Yeah.
And he would work, 70 or 80 hours a week just to earn overtime. So he was really driven. He was really a grinder. He wasn't just some guy trying to take down his employer from the sides.
I know. It's so astonishing.
It is amazing.
So my co-host James is here, and he has a question for you.
Sure. Hi, James.
I wanted to ask you about one quote that was in your article that I found really intriguing, which is basically music piracy became to the early 2000s what drug experimentation had been to the late 60s, a generation-wide flaunting of both social norms and the existing body of law with little thought for consequences. So I wanted to ask you about like young people's attitudes basically of music piracy and how you see like the future of that evolving as far as like how young people feel about piracy.
You know, it's funny, when I showed up at college in 1997, so I'm 36 years old, all of this stuff was just immediately available, and you never really thought at all about whether there was some kind of moral compulsion to pay for music. This was just the easiest and most obvious way to get it, and that tends to trump your sort of more moral concerns about who gets paid. I would say since about 2010, it has probably been easier just to buy it, particularly after the shutdown of Kim.com's Mega Upload. Now, when I talk to younger people, they're sort of aware of the previous model, but they almost entirely use subscription-based feeds. And this is sort of a broader trend that's happening in our society, where the internet is becoming much less of a free place and much more of a closed corporate system. Now, maybe that has to happen for creators to get paid, but there's drawbacks too. And I think the younger people that I know more or less accept it without asking too many questions.
I would say that there's sort of an existential aspect to what you write about in that particular moment in history, because towards the end of the article, you mention how after these guys in the scene had been doing this for about 10 years, they started to get bored with it.
Yeah.
And they started to kind of grow out of it and be sort of ready to move on. And, you know, you read that and you just think, wow, these guys, they tanked the music and film and other industries for no reason, just because they did it. Just because it was interesting to them at the time.
Because it was interesting to them at the time. They were kids. You know, I talked to, after the article came out, another guy, the former leader of the group, contacted me. He's now a very successful tech consultant and entrepreneur. He never went to college. He attributes his success in society entirely to the technical skills, and more importantly, like the organizational management stuff that he learned when he was running this piracy group when he was 15 years old. So in some ways, you have to remember the internet in 1995 or 1996 was so freeform. You know, there was no way to legally get music, even though you wanted it at the time, you know, via download. And so these guys essentially created an alternative infrastructure to do that. Now, because there were rival crews competing to sort of be the best at this, that inevitably caused them to sort of infiltrate the music industry's supply chain and get stuff out. But other pirate groups didn't necessarily do that. So if you look at groups like the Pirate Bay or some of the torrent sites, they tended to go for the media, but only once it was available. They weren't putting plants inside factories in the way that a group like RNS was.
Stephen, thank you so much for being on The Future of What. It's been such a delight to have you.
Yeah. Can I just plug my book?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the name of my book is How Music Got Free. It's available June 16th. You can pre-order it now from the retailers of your choice. You know, it tells this story. It also tells the story of the development of the MP3, and it tells the story of the history of rap music as seen through the perspective of the corporate label executives who were sort of putting together what we currently think of as a contemporary pop music landscape. And through those three stories, really, that's the whole thing. It's the story of how we all got online, and it's the story of how the music on your hard drive got there. So it's available June 16th, and the name is How Music Got Free.
Stephen Witt, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Ari Herstand is a musician and blogger who you can find at aristake.com. He also writes for Digital Music News. Ari, welcome to The Future of What?
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to talk to you because you recently wrote a great piece in Digital Music News in which you pointed out that there is a model in which free works, apps.
Yeah.
I love that piece, but the music business has not, of course, caught on yet. Can you talk to us about that a little bit?
Well, I think the biggest issue is that those who are kind of screaming the loudest or getting the most amount of press and media attention on the music side are all these classic rockers and all these people that grew up in the traditional music model where they only really understood how to make money one way. and they're kind of closed off to all the possibilities of new revenue streams and potential to make money with a music career in creative ways. And it's not just the classic rockers. I mean, it's a lot of people at the labels, and just a lot of people who made a lot of their money through the traditional streams of how you make money in the music industry. And then because that has been withered away over the years, over primarily over the last 10 years or so, and everyone's been kind of freaking out, most people aren't necessarily looking for solutions, sustainable solutions, that is. I would say a lot of these people are looking or putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. So yeah, I mean, I think the only way that we're going to actually make, or I should say, have a sustainable music industry where it's profitable across the board, up and down, all around, to everyone, to creators, songwriters, and the people kind of running the industry, is if we get very creative with the landscape that we currently have, and not just reminisce about the good old days of how it was when we charged $18 for a CD.
Right. So one of the things that you wrote in your article that I really appreciated was that when, there's something about like a vinyl album, you buy a vinyl album, you open it up, it's got liner notes, it's got lyrics, it's got photos. There's all of this stuff that comes with a vinyl album that is missing from the music experience online, and that nobody has really successfully captured that same experience. But really, there's a lot to be captured.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, no one has really been looking to innovate. It's always, everyone's just kind of trying to play catch up, because the free world, like the illegal world, if you will, innovates, and then the legitimate quote unquote services try to play catch up to the free services. Whereas like any company that comes out with the quote unquote legitimate licensed service that's truly innovative, that's who's going to win.
You can find Ari Herstand's writing and music at aristake.com. He joined us from LA. Ari, thanks for being on The Future of What?
Thanks for having me.
Glisten on the glowing ceiling screen, and ask the nice man who takes good care of me to please.
I'm Portia Sabin, and you're listening to The Future of What on X-Ray FM. Stay with us.
I've heard you whisper through the windy cracks. I've watched you blunder.
Aram Sinreich is a media studies professor at Rutgers University and the author of the recent book, The Piracy Crusade. Aram, welcome to The Future of What?
Thank you so much, Portia.
So I want to talk first about a paper that you wrote on copymism. Is that how you pronounce it?
Copymism, yeah, that's right.
Copymism, a new religion that was recognized in Sweden in 2012. Can you explain copymism to us?
Sure, as best as I can understand, the feverish imaginings of a bunch of Swedish radical philosophers. Basically, it's a new religion that, as you say, was officially recognized by Sweden as a legit religion in 2012, in which they believe that the internet is a holy instrument, and that, in fact, creating and spreading and remixing information is doing God's work, and that file sharing is an act of sacred devotion.
I love it.
Yeah, I love it too.
It's just,
I kind of came
amazing.
across it accidentally when I was writing my last book called The Piracy Crusade about 2 or 3 years ago, and I kind of included it at the end of the book as a way of looking forward and saying, this is moving beyond issues of law and technology, this really gets down to the very heart of what human beings care about, which is, what codes do we live by? What value systems do we belong to? But I kind of, threw it in a clever aside and left it at that. But it was a story that kind of kept gnawing at me when I was done with the book. So about a year later, I actually decided to go and interview a bunch of the more prominent copomists, including the technical founder of the religion, who's a very interesting young and very religious young guy from Sweden who was, at the time that he founded the religion, was a 19-year-old philosophy student at Uppsala University. But another major theologian that I interviewed was a minister in the EU Parliament, elected via the Pirate Party. So these are people who are not just pranksters and not just having a go at us. They're very thoughtful people who are deeply engaged in both questions of law and questions of morality and ethics.
It's so fascinating. We just had Stephen Witt on, and I don't know if you read his article in The New Yorker. He's about to publish his first book, which is called How Music Got Free.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you read that, but it's this fascinating article where he talks about basically the people who are responsible for file sharing in the U.S. and this one man, Del Glover, who smuggled over 2,000 records out of Universal's pressing plant before the release date, and is like personally responsible for basically, the demise of the record industry in America.
I've actually had that article open as a tab in Chrome for like 2 weeks. I haven't read it yet, so maybe you can give me the pressy.
Well, the most interesting part about it, I mean, there are a lot of interesting parts, but basically these file sharers were a highly organized technological group who called themselves the Scene,
Mm-hmm.
and they did file sharing entirely to gain cred amongst their peers. So,
amongst their peers of information liberators, or however they self-styled?
Yes. So what would happen is they wanted to be the first to put a new album up online before the release date. And that was entirely, it was like for the thrill. And Stephen was saying that he talked to these guys and they were saying basically they did it for a dopamine rush.
Yeah, well, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've spent a fair amount of time in my own research interviewing both music people and tech people, and I think this is the perfect intersection of these two strains of geekery. Both of which have to do with the kind of social credentials that come with being the first person to share a piece of information, right? So, I mean, you and I both grew up in the New York of the 1980s, and that was an era where I would go after school and spend all afternoon at a record shop, and make friends with the cool guys who worked there, and they would play for me like these crazy underground tapes, and if I was really lucky, make me a dub of those underground tapes, which I would then be really cool for showing to my friends. That kind of crate digger mentality is really endemic to popular music and has been for a long time, and of course has drastically changed in the age of the internet, where more or less everything is available, and the social capital comes from knowing what to find and where to find it, rather than being the first person to unearth it. And at the same time, on the other side of the fence, in the tech world, there is half a century now of hacker culture, which is among other things, one of the core values is that you show off your skills as a hacker by being the first person to liberate a piece of information from behind some kind of a firewall or digital lock and key. There's a great book by a guy named Doug Thomas called Hacker Culture. It came out about 15 years ago, where, based on interviews with people in that world, he talks about how, it's not about the information per se. We're not talking about someone like, Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden who are sharing information publicly because they feel the information is of vital importance to democratic society. They're liberating information in the hacker world, just as you say, for the dopamine rush of it and for the cred that comes from being the one who brings the information in question forth to the world at large.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a really interesting part of culture as it's developed over the last 20 years or so. There is a little bit of a contradiction, though, in your article, because you say that these copomists say that information should be public unless you want to keep it private.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I was pushing them on that. In addition to interviewing, Isaac Gerson and Christian Engstrom, the two kind of officials that I mentioned before, I spent a lot of time on IRC, on internet chat groups, talking to self-professed followers of Coppimism. And I asked them these kinds of questions. I said, well, do you believe all information should be free? And, yes, absolutely. Information exists to be copied. It's God's will that we copy it. Well, how about revenge porn? How about nuclear launch codes? And I kind of gave them all these hypothetical situations where spreading information seems like it would be morally or ethically a worse idea than keeping it to yourself. And ultimately, their thinking was remarkably subtle, and these are very thoughtful people who refuse to be backed into a kind of rhetorical corner. And basically, what they said is that it's really about the power dynamics that are engendered through information exchange. And if we're talking about the NSA spying on hundreds of millions of people around the world in these ridiculous dragnet operations, that is an exercise of institutional power over sovereign individuals that's unacceptable and immoral. And so they view surveillance and eavesdropping as not as a form of information sharing, but more as a form of information totalitarianism. And they view information sharing as valuable and meaningful when it produces new information that can be used to generate new social ideas. It's actually not all that different than, if you're a fan of political history, the kind of Jeffersonian ideal for the United States. Initially, Thomas Jefferson, didn't even think America should have a copyright law because he thought that it was dangerous to create a legal infrastructure for the monopolization of ideas. And he and James Madison, who was more cautiously in favor of copyright, had many back and forth arguments about this, even for decades following the Constitution, which established the foundations of copyright. But this notion that there needs to be a marketplace of ideas, that humankind benefits from more information being produced and shared, and most importantly, mixed in order to produce something new, that has really survived in Coppimist theology. But it's acquired a kind of moral valence that wasn't there when American law was created, and still isn't really part of American law. In fact, this is super geekery, but America went out of its way to kind of take the moral dimension out of copyright laws and out of our approach to information sharing, and we kind of put the logic of the marketplace in place of morality. So copyright in other countries, including Europe, where a lot of copymists live, still has this moral dimension. There's like the droit moral or the droit d'auteur, this kind of notion that when an artist creates something, they're connected to it in a kind of almost religious way, and that connection can never be severed, even if they sell the rights to their work to someone else. We don't have that in the U.S., and because of that, there's been this kind of hypertrophic relationship between capitalism and information over the last 200 years that's gotten to the point where now we produce more information in a year than humankind used to produce in a millennium, but it's owned by fewer and fewer entities. So you see the three major labels, used to be 6 when I started looking at this business 20 years ago, controlling 80% of the music marketplace, or you could say the same thing when it comes to music publishing, or the same thing when it comes to broadcasting with conglomerates like iHeartMedia, or the same thing when it comes to television with Viacom basically controlling music programming. So I'm just using music examples because that's the theme of your show, but really all information dissemination in post-industrial society is controlled by these giant cartelized organizations, and that kind of imbalance of power over the flow of information, and therefore over the social uses of the information, I think is, to Coppimists, that is inherently immoral because people will never have the ability to operate independently and communally under those conditions.
I think I got that from what you wrote, is that there's sort of a corporatist bias here where you feel like, where Coppimists might feel like, well, Universal is this huge conglomerate, and for us to share files is fine because it's coming from this, giant monolithic corporate source. But my question would be, how would the copymists feel about musicians who didn't, for example, want their music to be leaked before the release date?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question, and that was not one of the hypotheticals that I posed to them. So, I could only answer your question not as a practicing copymist myself, but as somebody who's talked to them. I would say that I would guess that copymists would respond by saying that some version of saying that the artist in question, was living with false consciousness, as Marx called it, that they were basically, a house slave who had, abnegated their, their sovereign rights over the world of ideas that they inhabited, in their desire to, to shack up with a corporate overlord. But again, I'm putting words into their mouths. I don't necessarily know that that's how and copymists actually, there's a diversity of viewpoints within practitioners as well. I mean, even when I talk to the founder of the religion, to Isaac Gerson, he's a guy who is able to encompass contradictions, and ultimately, because it's not a legalistic or even a rationalistic framework they're using, but rather a moralistic one, I think it really comes down to a kind of gut feeling for a lot of them. Is, does it feel right to share this kind of information? And I would guess that many copymists would say that leaking an album pre-release is all right because the relationship between the artist and the label is inherently exploitative, and therefore all they're doing is disrupting a system of exploitation. But I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'd love to actually take that question out into the field and ask them.
I'd be really interested because, honestly, I'm coming from a perspective of I run an independent record label. I am very much not Universal. Universal runs a movie studio. They have production companies. They're a huge media company.
Yep.
They're very diversified. All I do is put out records. And
very true, yeah. And Kill Rock Stars, I mean, by its very name, has kind of, staked its allegiance with the artist rather than with the corporate view of how music should be distributed.
Exactly. And yet my product became digital information through no effort or desire of my own. And overnight, I was faced with a situation in which, new technology basically made my product just as free as Universal's.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can't speak for the copymists in that situation, but I can say, for myself, and I've as I've been a consultant and an analyst for a long time, and have advised many record labels, large and small, about exactly this challenge. My feeling is that moving away from the moral dimensions of it, the reality is that we now live in an era where information is plentiful and infinitely reproducible, and it's harder and harder to keep information sequestered. And music becomes a form of information when you affix it to a medium like the internet or like a CD. So for better or for worse, I mean, I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong morally, but it's really incumbent upon companies like Kill Rock Stars to explore business models that presuppose that the music can be leaked and shared without your knowledge or consent or remuneration.
Well, absolutely. And also, we basically have a PR problem, as you're saying, and then also people aren't really aware that there's a difference between majors and independents. So
that is true.
We
and
just
there's
get
some
caught up in
indies
it.
That act more like majors
Of
than
course.
like indies.
Nowadays,
right?
especially, yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's how you make your bones now. Is that like if you're a major recording artist, you get your own imprint at the label, and that pays you a lot better than actually recording does, right?
It does. Adam Levine, we're talking to you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I think that guy's an unstoppable hit-making train.
Only naked, though.
Yeah.
100% naked all the time. Aram Sinreich is the author of The Piracy Crusade. Aram, thank you so much for being on The Future of What with us.
It's been such a great pleasure, Portia. Thank you for having me on the show.
You're listening to The Future of What on X-Ray FM. Don't touch that dial. I'm here in the studio with James Reeling, my partner in crime.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. You've been here the whole time, only sort of silent.
Yeah, I've just been relaxing.
Getting cozy. So we are talking now at the end of this hour, since we have just heard all of these awesome guests.
Yes.
And I wanted to see if anything stood out to you in particular that anyone said, anything really catch your ear, like, oh my God, I hadn't thought about that, or just anything that you really liked.
Well, I really liked all the interviews, but I'm particularly interested in the Copimism religion. I think that's very interesting. I would like to know more about the religious aspects and what they actually believe as far as like God or, what kind of consciousness they believe in. But just the idea of information being something that can be like kind of infinitely copied and reproduced and kind of like be disseminated into the world, very much like kind of like natural selection, where the information is like reproduced and then reproduced again and then continuously reproduced until it kind of becomes like its own organism in a way that is not even the same as what it started with, and it kind of becomes a life of its own that's disseminated around the world and then is copied again until it's no longer connected to the original. And I don't know, that's just what I was thinking about.
Well, I like that because in Aram's article he talks about how they say that biological reproduction is sort of their highest form of copying.
Yeah, and it's the same for all of life on Earth. It kind of comes down to like DNA, like reproducing itself, and it's kind of the same with information.
Right.
Maybe it doesn't have anything to do with music industry, but I think it's an interesting idea.
I like that. It's interesting because it more has to do with maybe like remixing in the music industry.
Yeah.
Which is in and of itself, we haven't talked much about it, but it's a huge thing.
Right.
Especially in certain countries. I know the UK is really into remixes of various songs, as opposed to the U.S. a little bit, but it's more like scenes are into it or certain genres are into it. It's not quite as huge here. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting and cool point, and I like it because it does sort of elevate that religion. It's even Aram says in his article, it's tempting to think of those people, of those copymist people, as sort of adolescent, people who are messing with you.
Right.
Because it seems like, I want to download files from the internet and give them to my friends for free, and I'm going to start a religion about it. It sounds kind of fake, but
yeah,
on one hand,
you can think of it as like kind of like this rationalization for doing something that, is ethically dubious. But on the other hand, it's like a very interesting like philosophical idea, I think, of like what is information and who owns it and how does it distribute it in the world, and kind of like going back to like The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, and like the idea of like that extending into like memes like on the internet that kind of like take on a life of their own by like crashing these different ideas together to create something new. And it's interesting to think about like where that will go in the future with technology, and even with like artificial intelligence, kind of like another form of that where it kind of takes a life of its own and eventually will take over and make us all slaves.
So look forward to that, people, in case you didn't have enough to worry about. I would say that the thing that I liked the best, or that I found the most interesting, was what Stephen Witt was saying about how he feels that the internet has become more of a corporate closed system in the days since all that file sharing was going on and people like the scene were active.
Yeah, the Wild West is kind of coming to an end.
Coming to an
yeah.
end, which I actually thought was really interesting, not just because it makes me feel better, like, oh God, we don't have to think, it's all just going to be BitTorrent from now on. It may very well be. I mean, I don't know. But really more just like everything changes.
Yeah.
And, we don't know what the future is going to be, but it's not always going to be exactly the same. And I think, Aram touched on that when he was saying one of the problems with corporations is they can't roll with it. Oh, and Ari said that too.
Right.
Corporations can't roll with stuff. They want to just keep doing it the way they've been doing it. And that's, something we've all learned in every walk of life is it does change, and you just have to be nimble.
Yeah, and the corporations definitely see it differently than like the fan does, where the corporations, it's like this, like, discrete product that they own and that they want to sell, whereas the fan like has like a personal relationship with it, and it almost becomes like a part of who they are. And there's a lot of ethical gray areas in that, I guess.
Right. And when we talked to you in our episode about direct to fan, and we were making you the super fan that you are.
Yeah.
That's kind of part of that is that, fans and their and artists have this special relationship where fans want to have a piece of that artist in some way. And so they're not just a commodity, they're like a piece of your life.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, very different from looking at it as a commodity, as like art as a commodity.
Yeah, and actually a very interesting example of that is HBO just released this new kind of documentary about Kurt Cobain, and it's called The Montage of Heck. And it's very interesting because it's all assembled from like tapes, like some tapes where he's just talking into a tape recorder about his life, home movies, all of these different things. And when I was a teenager, Nirvana was my favorite band. And when Kurt Cobain died, it was like very devastating for me. And it kind of changed my life in a lot of ways. But watching this documentary and seeing this footage and hearing the music again, like it just brought like this rush of memories for me where even though I've heard all of those songs, like, hundreds, maybe even thousands of times, like I was instantly brought back to like the very first time I heard those songs. And it was like this very like emotional experience for me, and I'm sure it is for a lot of other people as well. But I think that the fans' connection to the music is always something where it's going to be hard for the fan and for the corporate interest to kind of align, and like, how do you share this information that works out for both, I guess.
I agree. I remember where I was when I heard that Kurt Cobain had died, because I was young, obviously, so I could sleep later than I can now. And it was like 11 or 12 even, and I was still asleep. And I woke up, and the first thing I heard on the radio was Kurt Cobain was dead. And I ran to the window, and I looked outside, and the light was so weird. And it turns out it was a solar eclipse.
Oh.
And I thought I had died.
Oh, interesting.
I thought I had lost my mind. I was like, the light looks wrong. Everything is creepy, and Kurt is dead. Like, what is happening?
I was actually sleeping too when I found out. Like, I was taking a nap, and my phone rang, and it was one of my, because all my friends knew that I was like the biggest fan of Nirvana. I had like 7 posters in my room, and they called me, and they're like, so I was like not even awake. I like answered the phone, and they're like, "Did you hear that Kurt Cobain died?" And I'm like, "What?" And like that was like a month before I graduated from high school. So it was this weird pivotal time in my life, and that just kind of ended up punctuating it like perfectly.
Isn't that crazy? And I actually called a radio station for the first time in my life. I called a radio station and asked the DJ if it was true.
Oh, wow.
Because I just couldn't have, there was no handle on reality.
Yeah.
I was like, I feel like reality has escaped me. So I needed to like talk to a human. Like, tell me if this is true.
Yeah, it was a very surreal moment for our generation. And,
yeah.
And seeing this documentary really brought that all back to me in a way that I don't feel like anything else I've seen about Kurt Cobain or Nirvana really has. So I think that movie was excellent.
Cool. Well, this has been a very exciting and fun episode. Thank you, James, for hanging out with me.
Thank you.
And let's go back to the office.
Okay, let's get back to the MP3
Let's go back
minds.
to the MP3 minds. If you have a question you want answered on the show, please email us at thefutureofwhatshow@gmail.com. Our episodes are archived at killrockstars.com/thefutureofwhat, and you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Our program was engineered by Reed Harvey and is produced by Will Watts and John Sepulvedo. Special thanks to Digital One Studios. I'm Portia Sabin, president of Kill Rockstars. See you next week.
Have a taste of your ice cream? Can I lick the crumbs from your table?